The blizzard kicked off with a low whistle through the needles of the old-growth pines, a sound, like the heavy sigh of some waking giant. Up in the Blackwood Mountains of Montana, when December rolls around, the line between life and death is often as thin as newly formed skim ice on a lake. Cass Reed tightened the straps of her tactical pack, feeling the weight of the rescue gear digging into her shoulders. Her high-topped leather boots sank deep into the heavy powder with every step, making a steady crunch crunch sound. She'd lived in these mountains long enough to know that when the crows go silent and hole up in the rock crevices, it's time to find a spot by the fire. But today Cass wasn't hunting, and she wasn't on a rescue mission. She was checking the infrared trail cams along the gray wolf migration corridor, neighbors she respected more than anyone in the town down in the valley. As she neared the area known as the Forbidden Woods, a stretch of national park land that had been on lockdown for months due to internal security reasons cited by the sheriff's office, Cass froze in her tracks. Under the base of an ancient red pine, the snow was no longer pure white. Dark red streaks, looking like crushed rose petals, stretched into a grim trail across the ground. A hunter's instinct kicked in. She knelt down, pulled off a glove, and touched the red stain. It was still lukewarm, fresh blood, and the tracks weren't animal. They were the marks of someone desperately dragging themselves along. Cass drew her Colt 45 from her hip holster, thumbing the safety off with practiced ease. She followed the blood trail, her breath puffing out in thick white clouds. Rounding a patch of withered juniper, the sight before her made her lungs seize. A man was chained. He wasn't just tied up. His wrists were locked tight in cold steel handcuffs, looped around a gnarled tree root that jutted out of the ground like a monster's claws. He was face down, his khaki jacket ripped to shreds, revealing a back mottled with dark purple bruises and taser burns. His face was caked in mud and dried blood, his breathing so shallow it felt like a single falling snowflake might be enough to snuff it out. Hey, Cass dropped her center of gravity, moving closer but keeping a wary distance. I'm here to help. Can you hear me? The man didn't move. Cass stepped up and placed a hand on his shoulder to check his carotid pulse. The moment her fingers touched his feverish neck, the man bolted awake. It wasn't the alertness of a conscious man. It was the final fight-or-flight burst of a cornered animal. With a choked growl, he spun around, using his handcuffed hands as a weapon, swinging hard at Cass. Her reflexes were lightning fast. She leaned back, dodging a strike that could have snapped her collarbone, but the man didn't stop. He lunged at her, using his body weight to tackle her into the snow. His eyes were bloodshot and hollow, looking at her, but not truly seeing her. Don't touch me, he rasped, his trembling hands trying to find purchase on Cass's throat. Cass didn't use her gun. She knew this guy was out of it, suffering from head trauma and blood loss. Using a rescue joint lock, she twisted out of his grip and pressed firmly on a pressure point beneath his jaw. The man shivered once and went limp in her arms. Damn it, Cass muttered under her breath. You trying to kill the only person saving your skin? She quickly pulled a multi-tool kit from her med bag. These cuffs were standard-issue law enforcement gear, not some over-the-counter toy. It took her nearly 3 minutes to jimmy the lock with a thin wire. As the cuffs hit the snow with a dull clink, she finally got a good look at the victim. This guy wasn't a local. His skin lacked the weathered toughness of the Montana elements, and his clothes shredded, as they were still spoke of city slicker refinement. Cass gently rolled him over to patch an open wound on his side. That's when she found the thing she was never supposed to see. Inside his breast pocket was a small leather wallet. When she flicked it open, a brass badge caught the fading twilight. Gabriel Vance, Internal Affairs, Department of Justice. Cass' heart hammered against her ribs. What was a Fed doing in a godforsaken hole like Blackwood? And why had he been tortured like a prisoner of war? She kept searching for meds or clues about his attacker. In the hidden flap of the wallet, there was an old dog-eared photo. Cass went stone cold. In the photo, 2 men stood next to a black truck at the edge of the woods. One was a scarred man she'd never met, but the other she knew better than anyone in the world. It was Elias Thorne, the sheriff of Blackwood, the foster father who had pulled her from a car wreck 20 years ago, the man who taught her how to shoot how to read tracks, and how to live with integrity. In the forward, and the wagon rolled out of Caldwell. He was accepting a briefcase from the scarred man. Behind them were wooden crates stamped with the strange symbols of a leaked antiquities organization. A chill ran down Cass's spine, colder than the blizzard howling outside. She looked at the unconscious Gabriel Vance, then toward the valley where the town lights were starting to flicker. Elias had told her the woods were closed because of aggressive grizzlies. He'd warned her never to set foot in here. "Pop, what have you done?" she whispered into the wind. A wolf's howl echoed from the distance, but this time it didn't bring its usual sense of peace. It sounded like a warning. Cass knew she couldn't leave Gabriel here. If someone had chained him to that tree, they'd be back soon to see if their quarry was dead yet. She hit Gabriel with a dose of morphine in the shoulder to stave off shock, then used her rescue rope and a foldable tarp stretcher from her pack to rig a makeshift sled. Cass was a strong woman, but hauling a guy pushing 188 pounds to waist-deep snow was the ultimate gut check. Step by step she dragged him out of the forbidden woods. Gabriel's blood continued to seep, staining the tarp. Cass had to constantly kick snow over their trail to throw anyone off the scent. She didn't head for town. She couldn't trust anyone wearing a badge in Blackwood right now. Her destination was the isolated cabin perched on the western cliffs, the place she called home, but which was effectively a small fortress she'd built to distance herself from the world. The blizzard began to dump down in earnest. Visibility dropped to less than 10 feet. Cass's teeth were gritted, her grip tight on the tow rope, her calves burning like they were being stuck with needles. In her mind, the image of the IA badge and Elias Thorne's stern face kept spinning. If Gabriel Vance woke up and the evidence he carried was the real deal, Cassidy Reed's world was going to go up in flames. But if he was the enemy, she had just signed her own death warrant. The lights from the cabin appeared like a ghost in the whiteout. Cass summoned her last bit of strength, hauled Gabriel over the wooden threshold, then slammed the door shut, throwing all three dead bolts. She leaned her back against the door, gasping for air, sweat pouring down her face in the sub-zero cold. The heat from the fireplace began to lick at the dry pine logs, sparking a crackle that shattered the suffocating silence in the room. Cass didn't take off her coat. She knelt beside Gabriel, her hands moving fast as she used medical shears to cut away his blood-soaked shirt. Under the flickering firelight, the wounds looked even more brutal than they had out in the snow, purple bruises lining his ribs, a deep gash on his bicep already showing signs of infection, and worst of all, the injury at the base of his skull, the unmistakable mark of a professional pistol whipping. She poured hard liquor over a gauze pad and pressed it firmly against his side. Gabriel jerked, a choked moan escaping his cracked lips. His eyes fluttered open, glassy and disoriented, staring blankly at the timber ceiling before locking onto Cass's face. What is? He rasped, a trembling hand trying to grab her wrist. "Stay still. You're in a safe house," Cass said, her voice low and commanding. "I'm Cassidy Reed. I found you in the Forbidden Woods. If you want to keep breathing long enough to finish whatever job you're on, shut up and let me stitch you back together." Gabriel looked down at the medkit, then saw his investigator's badge sitting on the wooden table nearby. The suspicion in his eyes faded a fraction, but the fear remained. Elias Thorne. I know, Cass cut him off, a sharp pang hitting her chest at the sound of that name coming from a victim's mouth. "I saw the photo in your wallet, but now's not the time for politics. You're burning up with a fever." She focused on the task, using surgical thread to throw precise stitches. Every time the needle pierced his skin, Gabriel ground his teeth so hard the tendons in his jaw stood out. Once the final stitches were set, Cass helped him drink some warm honey water mixed with painkillers. He drifted off for a moment, his breathing leveling out, but his hand stayed clamped onto the hem of her jacket, as if he were afraid of slipping back into that death trap outside. Cass stood up and walked to the window. Peeking through a slit in the leather curtains, she looked out at the whiteout. The blizzard had covered their tracks, but she knew Elias wasn't a man who relied on luck. If he'd ordered a federal agent chained up in the woods, he was ready for all-out war. A strange noise drifted from the base of the hill. It wasn't the wind. It was the low growl of snowmobile engines faint, but to the sharp ears of a hunter, It was as loud as thunder. Damn it, Cass hissed. She grabbed her thermal binos from the shelf. 3 orange heat signatures were moving slowly about 800 yards out. They were spreading out, flanking her in a pincer movement. She turned back to Gabriel. He was a bit more alert thanks to the meds. "They're here, aren't they?" he asked, his voice gravelly. 3 of them. Snowmobiles. "Definitely Elias's boys," Cass said, quickly packing gear. She flipped open a hidden compartment in the floorboards beneath the hearth. "Can you move? I need the truth." Gabriel struggled up, the pain turning his face ashen, but he nodded. "I'll crawl if I have to." "But Cass, why help me? You know who Elias is." Cass paused, meeting his gray eyes. "Because he taught me that a hunter never leaves wounded prey for the vultures. And because I need the damn truth about the man who raised me." She tossed him a thick fur coat. "Into the cellar, now. There's an escape tunnel that leads out to Devil's Throat Canyon. Move." Cass's cellar wasn't just for food storage. It was a small labyrinth of stone and timber built into an old mine shaft. Just as they hit the bottom step, the roar of the engines died right outside the front door. A heavy, authoritative knock thudded against the wood. "Cass, you in there, girl?" It was Miller's voice, Elias's most loyal deputy, the man Cass used to call Uncle when he dropped by for Christmas. "The sheriff's worried about you. This is one hell of a storm to be riding out alone on the ridge." Cass signaled Gabriel to stay dead silent. She stood at the foot of the wooden stairs, her hand tight around her sidearm. She knew Miller wasn't checking on her safety. He was looking for the body that was no longer at the base of that red pine. "I was sleeping, Uncle Miller," Cass shouted back, keeping her voice steady and slightly groggy. "What's so urgent you're hauling tail up here in the middle of a blizzard? Open up, honey. We've got an escapee on the loose out here. The sheriff wants me to bring you down to town where it's safe." "I'm fine. I've got my guns and the dogs. Just head on back." The silence stretched for several seconds, heavy enough that Cass could hear her own heart thumping. Then the heavy thud of boots sounded on the porch. "Elias said you'd be stubborn," Miller said, his voice stripped of any warmth. "But I see blood on the doorstep, Cass. The snow hides a lot, but it don't hide the scent of iron from a man's blood." Bang! A shot tore through the front door lock. Cass pulled Gabriel deeper into the darkness of the mine shaft, just as the door above was kicked in. The heavy stomp of cleated boots echoed on the floorboards right over their heads. "Sweep the place. Find that Fed and the girl," Miller bellowed. Cass led Gabriel through the narrow tunnel, lit only by a dim headlamp she'd masked with red cloth to stay stealthy. The tunnel sloped down toward the canyon. Cold, damp air filled her lungs. "Cass," Gabriel whispered as they stopped for air to fork, "you don't have to do this. Take this drive and turn yourself in. You're his daughter. He won't kill you." He held out a small, waterproof wrap device he'd hidden in the lining of his sock. "Everything's on here. The list of officials on the take from the Antiquities Ring, the shipments crossing the Canadian border every Friday night. Elias isn't just a dirty cop. He's the architect of this whole damn empire in Montana." Cass looked at the drive, then into the darkness behind them where the beams of flashlights began to sweep the tunnel entrance. She felt her soul crumbling. The father she'd idolized, the man who taught her about honor, was the same man who turned this beautiful land into a slaughterhouse for profit. "He will kill me, Gabriel," Cass said, her voice bitter, "because I've seen what I wasn't supposed to. In Blackwood, if you're not part of the system, you're a loose end that needs clipping. Elias didn't raise me out of love. He raised me to be a hound for his own ends. But today this hound isn't bringing the prey home." She snatched the drive and shoved it into her inner coat pocket. "Let's go. Devil's Throat has a trail only the locals know. If we make the other side by sunrise, we can hit the state ranger station." They kept moving, sometimes crawling through sections where the ceiling hung low. Gabriel's wound started bleeding through the dressing Cass had applied. He ground his teeth, refusing to make a sound. When they finally emerged from the tunnel mouth, tucked between 2 sheer rock walls, the blizzard hadn't let up. The wind howled like a banshee through the deep canyon. "Freeze!" A shout rang out from the top of the cliff. The high beams of a snowmobile cut through the dark, blinding them. Cass squinted, seeing the towering silhouette of Elias Thorne standing by the machine. He was wearing his heavy bearskin coat and his trademark Stetson, looking as dignified and respectable as ever. but the sniper rifle in his hand was leveled straight at his foster daughter. Cassidy, Elias called over a megaphone, his voice booming through the canyon, cutting over the wind. You're making a fatal mistake. The man next to you is a wanted criminal, a spy. He's played you. Drop it, Dad, Cass screamed back, hot tears stinging her eyes before freezing on her cheeks. I saw the photo. I saw what you did to him. You can't gaslight me anymore. Elias was silent for a long moment. Under the glare of the lights, he seemed to age 10 years, but his eyes remained as cold as permafrost. I hoped you were smarter than this, Cass. I gave you everything, a home, a career, this whole mountain at your feet. All I asked was that you didn't stick your nose where it didn't belong. Selling out Montana to relic runners is my business because this is my home. Cass raised her Colt, aiming true at her father. Step aside, Elias. Let us pass, or I swear I'll fire. You don't have the stomach for it, girl, Elias said, his voice dripping with pity. I'm the one who taught you how to squeeze the trigger. Remember? I know how your heart's racing. You can't kill the man who gave you a second life. Right then, Miller and two other deputies emerged from the tunnel exit right behind Cass and Gabriel. They were caught in a crossfire. Take 'em, Elias barked, his voice turning to steel. Don't hit the girl. The other one's expendable. Run, Gabriel. Aim for the pines, Cass yelled, opening fire on Miller's group to give them cover. The gunshots thundered through the canyon, triggering a small powder slide from the cliffs above. In the chaos of falling snow and sweeping lights, Cass grabbed Gabriel's hand and lunged down the steep slope, leading into the heart of the black pine forest. They slid through the snow, dry branches clawing at their faces and clothes. Cass' back slammed into a fallen juniper trunk mid-slide, the jarring impact knocking the wind out of her. Snow caked her goggles, leaving her blind and freezing. She scrambled in the dark until her hands brushed the coarse wool of a fur coat. Gabriel, you okay? She hissed through gritted teeth, frantically brushing the powder off his face. Gabriel didn't answer right away. He lay there, his chest heaving violently. The wound in his side had soaked to his outer layers, blooming into a dark stain under the faint moonlight that peeked through the storm clouds. He ground his teeth, pushing himself up on shaking elbows. Keep going. Don't stop. The roar of snowmobiles echoed from the ridge above. Headlights swept through the pines like the glowing eyes of demons. Cass knew Elias wouldn't call it quits. He knew these woods, but so did she. She'd spent 10 years setting traps and running rescues on these exact coordinates. Lean on me, Cass commanded, throwing Gabriel's arm over her shoulder. We have to get deeper into the black pine core. The brush is too thick in there. Their rigs won't make it. They trudged through knee-deep snow. Every step was pure agony for Gabriel, but he didn't let out a single whimper. The investigator's sheer grit amazed Cass. It seemed like his faith in justice was the only thing keeping his heart beating. As the engines drew closer, Cass stopped abruptly by a limestone ledge covered in dry moss. She pulled a spool of tripwire from her hip pouch, with fingers nimble despite the numbing cold. She strung the wire between two pines across the only navigable trail, just a foot above the snowline. What are you doing? Gabriel rasped. Giving them a hunter's welcome, Cass replied coldly. No sooner had she spoken than the first set of high beams rounded the corner. A deputy named Wade came barreling down the slope at breakneck speed. He never saw the thin wire hidden by the drifting powder. When the treads hit the snag, the rig bucked violently, pitching Wade forward. His face slammed into the handlebars before he was tossed like a rag doll, landing motionless yards away. The snowmobile flipped, its engine screaming in a mechanical death rattle before cutting out. One down, Cass said, without a shred of pity. She didn't stop to check if Wade was breathing. In this game, mercy was a death sentence. They pushed into the rougher terrain, where erratic boulders blocked the way and the pine canopy was so dense the snow barely touched the forest floor. Here the darkness was absolute. Cass cut her red light, navigating by memory alone. Cass, Gabriel stopped, leaning against a rock hollow. Um, I'm fading. Losing too much blood. She helped him sit, feeling the cold leaching the life out of him. She dug into her pack, pulled out a chemical heat pack, pressed it to his chest, and forced a swig of whiskey from a small stainless flask down his throat. Listen, Gabriel. Elias isn't just hunting you for that drive. He's hunting you because he's scared. If a Fed vanishes in Blackwood, he can chalk it up to a mountain accident. But if you walk out of here with that evidence, his empire goes up in smoke overnight. Gabriel gave a weak chuckle, blood flecking the corner of his mouth. You know, he's not the only one in Montana in on this. There are names on that list. That'll make it so you never trust a soul again. I stopped trusting people the second my father leveled a gun at me, Cass replied, her voice thick with emotion. She looked down at her hands, the same hands Elias had held when he taught her to tie her first knot. This betrayal wasn't just a legal matter, it was a soul-crushing blow. The snap of a dry branch echoed from behind. It wasn't a machine, it was Boots. Slow, steady, and terrifyingly professional. They ditched the rigs, Cass whispered, her grip tightening on her Colt. Elias is tracking us personally. She pulled Gabriel up, but this time he pushed her away. Leave me. I'll draw them off. You run get that drive to the state rangers. Shut it, Gabriel, Cass hissed. I didn't bust you out of those chains just to leave you for that old man to carve up. We're getting out together, or we're staying here for good. She led him through a narrow crevice toward Devil's Throat Canyon. It was named for the devil because the wind there could blow a grown man off a 100-meter drop. But tucked into the cliffside was a small cave, an old prospector's hideout from the last century, its entrance, masked by a natural, pivoting rock. They slipped inside just as a flashlight beam swept over the spot they'd occupied seconds before. Cass held her breath, ear pressed against the freezing stone. Cassidy! Elias's voice boomed, so close she could feel the vibration through the rock. I know you're close. I can smell the pine resin on your coat. Don't make this harder than it has to be. Hand over the investigator, and I promise you coming home. I'll tell everyone you bravely intervened in an accident, and we'll go back to being a family. Cass closed her eyes. The offer was a siren song. To go back to the warmth, the fake honor, the father she once loved. But then she looked at Gabriel, shivering in the dark, a victim of his own integrity. She saw the rot beneath the lost hero persona. Family doesn't shame people to trees to rot, Elias, she shouted back, her voice like iron. Family doesn't sell out our ancestors' history for blood money. A terrifying silence followed. Then the shots rang out. Crack. Track. Bullets slammed into the exterior rock, throwing sparks. Elias was done talking. He was going for the kill. They'll find the mouth of this cave soon, Gabriel said, his voice strangely calm, as if he'd accepted his fate. Not if we beat them to the punch, Cass replied. She lit a small candle, illuminating a passage leading deep into the mountain. This leads to the old Blackwood mine. That's where Elias stashes his haul. If we're going to take him down, we have to go into the lion's den. They moved through the gloom of the abandoned mine shaft. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and rock dust. Cass knew this was a hell of a gamble. The mine had been shuttered since the 90s due to unstable structures, but that was exactly why Elias used it as his warehouse. No one dared set foot here except those with nothing left to lose. After nearly an hour of silent trekking, they saw electric light in the distance. Handheld LED strips were strung along a massive cavern. Cass and Gabriel ducked behind a stack of wooden crates. Before them were hundreds of crates, carved with the ancient symbols of Montana's indigenous tribes' priceless treasures, stolen from national sites. In the center of the cavern sat a large safe and a desk bristling with high-tech comms gear. This is it, Gabriel whispered, his eyes lighting up. This is the physical evidence I need. The drive is just data, this is the smoking gun. But their victory was short-lived. The sound of footsteps converged on the main chamber from multiple directions. Elias Thorne stepped through the main mine entrance, followed by Miller and 3 mercenaries in black tactical gear armed to the teeth. Elias didn't look tired after the hunt. He calmly pulled off his leather gloves and tossed them on the desk. I knew you'd head here, Cass, Elias said without looking around. You were always curious about secrets, and you always chose the hard way to prove yourself. Cass stepped out from cover, her Colt leveled at Elias. Gabriel gripped a crate to stay upright beside her. It's over, Dad, Cass said, her voice shaking but her gaze fixed. The marshals are coming. He sent word before you snatched him. She was bluffing, hoping a mind game would work. Elias let out a dry, hollow laugh. Federal marshals, you think they care about an IA agent missing in a blizzard? In Blackwood, I am the law, and the law doesn't arrest itself. He slowly drew a silver-plated sidearm, aiming it at Gabriel's head. Now, Cassidy, the final choice. Walk over to me, hand over that drive, and I'll give this guy a quick death. Or you stay there, and I'll have to bury my proudest achievement right next to him. You won't shoot me, Cass challenged, though cold sweat was trickling down her neck. I taught you that in a hunt, the one who hesitates is the one who dies, Elias replied coldly. Don't make me pull rank on your life. Cass looked into Elias's eyes and realized the bitter truth. This man wasn't her father anymore. He was just a shell corrupted by power and greed. The only emotion left was the sting of a lost past. With that pain now forged a strength she needed to pull the trigger. Cass's finger tightened on the trigger, the cold steel sending a jolt of ruthless clarity straight to her brain. In the vast chamber of the Blackwood mine, the LED lights glaring down at the crates of antiquities made them look like rows of coffin secrets. Elias stood his ground, the silver-plated sidearm in his hand rock-steady. A terrifying stillness settled over the face of the man who had once been her entire world. You think I'm gonna blink, Cassidy? Elias's voice dropped an octave, echoing off the damp rock walls. I know you won't, Cass replied, her voice no longer shaking. Because you killed my father the second you chained Gabriel to that tree. The tension snapped when Elias gave a faint twitch of his lip, a silent go signal. But before he could squeeze the trigger, Cass didn't aim for him. She swung her muzzle toward an old gas line running along the ceiling, right above a pile of wooden crates packed with dry straw and tinder. Bang! The round tore through the rusted steel. A high-pitched hiss filled the air. Cass immediately flicked her burning Zippo toward the leak. A massive fireball erupted, blowing back the mercenaries closing in. The explosion wasn't deafening, but the pressure wave made the shaft shudder, raining rock dust down like snow. Go! Cass bellowed, grabbing Gabriel's arm and hauling him through the gray haze toward the safe. Elias was blindsided by his daughter's dead man's ham gamble. He returned fire, but the smoke and splintered crates provided a makeshift shield. In the chaos, Cass didn't just bolt for the exit. She knew if she didn't have something heavy to trade, they'd never make it out of this hole alive. She shoved Gabriel into the blind spot behind the massive safe. Punch it in. You said you knew how. Gabriel, ghostly pale from blood loss, reached for the electronic keypad with trembling fingers. The code, it's the town's founding date. Combined with his badge number, I pieced it together from the internal files. The rhythm of cleated boots hitting the stone floor grew louder. Miller was screaming orders for the squad to flank them. Cass leaned her back against the safe, laying down suppressive fire to keep them at bay. Every shot was surgical, threading the gaps between crates, forcing the crew to stay pinned. Got it, Gabriel yelled. The heavy door groaned open. It wasn't just cash inside. It was an archive, ledgers detailing bribes, dossiers on politicians in Helena, and a professional-grade digital recorder. Cass snatched the recorder and the most critical files, stuffing them into Gabriel's pack. Take this. This is your get-out-of-jail-free card, she snapped, then shoved him toward a narrow drainage culvert at the back of the chamber. This leads straight to the dry creek bed out east. Follow the flow until you hit the ranger station. Don't look back. What about you? Gabriel caught her hand, his eyes wide with worry. I have to settle the tab with him. If I run, he'll hunt us to the ends of the earth. If I stay, he stays on me. Cass looked at him, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. Go, investigator. Prove that backbone still counts for something in Montana. Gabriel gave her one last look, nodded, and vanished into the shadows of the culvert. Cass stood up and took a deep breath. She grabbed a radio off a downed mercenary, thumbing the dial to the local police frequency. She knew every deputy in Blackwood was carrying, and tonight the blizzard kept them glued to their comms. She stepped out into the center of the cavern, where the fire was still gutting the contraband crates. Elias emerged from the smoke, silver pistol still leveled. His face was a mask of twisted rage. Where is he? Elias roared. Cass lowered her gun and raised her hands, but in her palm she held the radio keyed to a high-output broadcast. You want the truth, Elias. Cass spoke up, her voice clear and booming. projecting through the radio waves to every patrol car and scanner in the county. Tell me, when did you start selling out our ancestors' graves? When did a federal agent's life become something you could put a price tag on? Elias stopped, narrowing his eyes. He hadn't spotted the trap. The arrogance of a man who'd been king for too long had blinded him. What are you babbling about? The world runs on reality, Cassidy. Blackwood is dirt poor. My people have no jobs. Those relics under the dirt don't do anyone a lick of good. I sell them to keep this town breathing, to pay my men, to put you through school. By killing people? By chaining them up like animals? Cass took a step forward, her eyes blazing. You say you do it for the town, or for that blood-soaked throne you're sitting on? How many people have you put in the ground to protect us? Elias gave a dry, raspy laugh. Kindness doesn't build order, girl. Only power and fear do that. That Fed was a parasite. He wanted to tear down everything I built. I gave him a chance to walk away quietly, but he chose the hard way. And now so have you. He stepped closer, the muzzle less than 6 feet from her chest. Hand over the drive, and maybe I'll let you die like a sheriff's daughter instead of a turncoat. You just confessed, Elias, Cass whispered, her smile making him freeze. She held up the radio. From the speaker, static and urgent code calls began to flood in. Sheriff, you copy? What the hell is going on? A voice crackled. Pruitt was Wade, the young deputy coming to, his voice full of shock and horror. Elias' face went from pale to a bruised purple. He realized his entire admission of smuggling and murder had just been broadcast live on the public band. The subordinates who idolized him, the townspeople who saw him as a hero, they had just seen the devil's true face. You little, Elias hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. Bang! The bullet grazed Cass's shoulder, the heat searing through her fur coat and skin. She didn't flinch. She lunged with the raw instinct of a predator. Father and daughter grappled amidst the wreckage of the mine. Elias was older, but his experience and sheer brutality were nothing to sneeze at. He slammed his pistol grip into her ribs, sending her sprawling into the rock dust. You think you won? Elias pinned her down, his massive hands squeezing the life out of her throat. I am the law here. Nobody touches me. Cass gasped for air, her vision tunneling. But in the gloom of the shaft, she heard another sound. Not the wind, not the fire. It was the wail of sirens at the mine entrance. Red and blue lights strobed against the limestone. The screech of tires on heavy snow. Drop the weapon, state police. Hands in the air, Elias froze. He turned his head toward the entrance. It wasn't just the state troopers. His own men Miller, Wade, and the others were standing there, shell-shocked. They had their guns trained on their leader, not to protect him, but with a cold, hard sense of betrayal. Broken trust was a sharper blade than any bullet. Taking advantage of his lapse, Cass summoned every ounce of strength to kick his knee out, breaking his grip. She scrambled back, lungs burning as she gulped in the smoky air. Elias stood up, alone in the vault of his own crimes. He looked at the silver gun in his hand, then at his bleeding foster daughter at his feet. For the first time in her life, Cass saw fear in Elias's eyes, not of death, but of the collapse of the power trip he'd spent a lifetime building. He didn't surrender. Elias Thorne raised his gun, but not at the cops. He aimed for the industrial blasting caps stored in the corner of the vault. If I don't get Blackwood, nobody does, Elias roared. Crack. A single shot rang out from the tunnel entrance. It wasn't Cass. It was Miller. The round caught Elias square in the gun arm, sending the silver pistol flying. The police flooded in like a tide. Elias was slammed onto the stone floor, his wrist snapped into the very same pair of bracelets he used to break others. He didn't scream. He just stared at the ceiling, his eyes as hollow as a dry well. Cass stood up, her shoulder throbbing, and blood still trickling, but she felt strangely light. She walked out of the mine, moving through the crowd of officers and the stares of the locals. Outside, the blizzard had quit. The sun began to crest over the Blackwood ridges, painting the White Valley in a thin wash of gold. Gabriel was sitting on the bumper of an ambulance, a space blanket draped over his shoulders. When he saw Cass emerge, he stood up, limping toward her. They didn't say a word. Gabriel just placed a silent hand on her shoulder, a gesture of thanks, and the shared bond of those who had walked through the fire together. "It's over," Gabriel said softly. No, Cass looked toward the town emerging in the dawn light. Now is when Blackwood actually starts over. She looked down at her hands, the new scars mingling with the old. She had lost a father, but she had finally found her footing. The wail of the ambulance sirens faded at the base of the hill, giving way to an eerie silence that settled over Blackwood Peak. Cass stood there, letting the biting wind sting the untended wound on her shoulder, her eyes tracking the convoy escorting Elias Thorne until it vanished behind the ancient pines. The snow had let up, leaving the Montana sky a piercing quartz, blue alight, so pure it seemed intent on dragging every filthy corner of this land out into the light of justice. Gabriel Vance limped up beside her. His face was still ashen, but his gray eyes had regained the sharp edge of a federal agent. He looked down at the town below, where thin spirals of hearth smoke began to rise as peacefully as if a massacre hadn't just gone down. "The Marshal's tactical team will take over the scene within the hour," Gabriel said, his voice gravelly but warmer than she'd ever heard it. "All those antiquities, the ledgers. It's enough to bury Elias and his network for good. You didn't just save me, Cass. You saved the soul of this whole county." Cass reached down to retrieve her old compass from the dirt. The glass face was shattered from the impact in the mine. She turned it over in her palm, feeling like her own life had just been cracked wide open the same way. "I didn't do it for honor, Gabriel. I did it because I couldn't stand by and watch the man who taught me about integrity spit on it like that." A week later, the town of Blackwood was rocked by a truth bomb. Headlines about the hero sheriff and his dark empire plastered every paper from Helena to Seattle. The locals, who had treated Elias like a patron saint, were blindsided by the evidence brought to light. The sheriff's office was taped off, and several of Elias's inner circle were hauled in for questioning. Miller took the coward's way out, taking his life and holding and carrying the last of their secrets to the grave. Cass didn't stick around to watch the fallout. She retreated to her cabin, taking time to patch her wounds and clear the wreckage of the fight. She no longer felt safe in her own skin there. Every corner of the room, every piece of gear felt like it belonged to Elias. The armchair where he used to read the paper, the first hunting rifle he'd given her hanging on the wall, they were all ghosts now. At twilight one evening, with the sunset bleeding a deep crimson over the peaks, there was a soft knock at the door. Cass gripped her sidearm by instinct before opening it. Gabriel stood there, no longer the shredded victim. He wore a dark topcoat, looking every bit the polished Department of Justice official. The gashes on his face had scabbed over, leaving a faint scar along his jawline, a badge of honor from their survival. "I came to say goodbye," Gabriel said, his smile tinged with a bit of gloom. "The case file is going federal. I have to head back to D.C. to testify before the grand jury." Cass leaned against the doorframe, taking him in. "So, mission accomplished. Thanks to you." Gabriel pulled a small folder from his coat. "These are the papers confirming your legal title to this land. Elias kept the deed murky to keep you on a short leash, but the law's on your side now. You don't owe him a damn thing anymore, Cassidy." She took the papers, feeling the weight of true freedom for the first time in her life. "Thanks, Gabriel." "Cass." Gabriel hesitated, taking a step closer. "Montana's beautiful, but it's a graveyard of bad memories for you right now. If you want, there's a high-altitude rescue outfit in Seattle, looking for a lead with your skill set. I could pull some strings." Cass looked out toward the blackened ridges, where the wolves were beginning to howl into the cold night. She smiled a real, peaceful smile. "I'm a daughter of the Blackwood Wilds, Gabriel. I spent my whole life learning to survive here. If I leave, Elias actually wins, because he'll have chased me out of my own home. I'm staying. I'm going to fix this place up, turn it into a real rescue center. No secrets, no contraband." Gabriel nodded, realizing the woman in front of him didn't need anyone's protection. She was the hunter, the protector, and now, the master of her own fate. He reached out his hand, and this time Cass took it, a firm, ironclad grip between two people who had crawled out of hell together. "Keep in touch, Cass," Gabriel said before turning to head down the snow-covered trail. As time passed, the brutal winter finally buckled under the weight of spring. Snowmelt turned into rushing creeks, bringing new life to the scarred pine forests. Cass hired crews to overhaul the cabin. She tore down the old photos of Elias, who placing them with detailed topographical maps and state-of-the-art rescue gear. Elias Thorne was handed a life sentence without parole at a max security facility in another state. Cass never visited. To her, the man who raised her died that night in a blizzard. The man sitting in that cell was just a shadow made of greed and betrayal. One April morning, Cass received an overnight package from D.C. Inside was a sleek wooden box. When she opened it, she found her old compass. But it wasn't broken anymore. The glass had been replaced with scratch-resistant sapphire. The needle was finely gold-plated, and on the back, a small inscription was engraved, "For Cassidy Reed, who always finds the way out of the dark." GV attached was a note with the coordinates to a small coffee shop overlooking the Seattle harbor, along with a message: "If the mountains ever get too quiet, come find me. There's always a spot for Montana's finest hunter." Cass smiled, tucking the compass into her jacket pocket. She stepped out onto her porch, breathing in the fresh scent of pine resin and damp earth after a spring rain. In the distance, the gray wolf pack she'd been tracking now had new pups, running free through the migration corridor without the fear of a relic runner's trap. She picked up her binoculars and got to work. It wasn't a chase anymore. It was a silent watch over the land she loved. Cassidy Reed was no longer the daughter of a criminal. She was the ghost of Blackwood Mountain, free, fierce, and full of hope. The morning sun lit her path, a road she would lead herself down from now on, guided by her own moral compass.